public companies in Canada are required to have policies to make it easier for employees to blow the whistle on fraud or other types of unethical corporate behavior. But should private companies and small businesses be required to have whistleblower policies as well? That question was up for discussion as the Canadian Society of Corporate Secretaries annual conference on corporate governance got underway in Montreal today. Businesses in general lose about 5% of their annual revenues to fraud, according to the BC-based consulting agency WhistleBlower Security. Small private businesses tend to lose even more. That's because employees, vendors, and customers at smaller firms often don't have tools like anonymous tip lines. More than 40% of corporate fraud is discovered that way. Studies show typically it takes 18 months before fraud is detected, but a whistleblower policy makes it 50% more likely that fraud is detected earlier. Shannon Walker is president of WhistleBlower Security. She's a speaker at the Montreal conference. Great to have you with us.
Thanks, Amanda.
So it does seem, let's start with, I guess, the evidence that whistleblower regulations work at big public companies. Is there lots of evidence that this is working the way it's supposed to?
I don't know if it's working the way it's supposed to. It's definitely something that's mandated for all the public companies. Whether or not they're actually embracing it and putting it out to their employees is another thing. But in the U.S., it's certainly something that's much more standardized. In Canada, under the Ontario Securities legislation, it's standardized as well. But it's a bit of a more slow. I think it hasn't been embraced as much in Canada to date. However, having said that, private companies and nonprofits are really starting to look at this as a best practice and something to introduce to really engage with their employees and encourage a speak up kind of a culture.
What are some of the deterrents to implementing this kind of system? Would cost be one of them for a smaller company?
No, cost isn't one. I think that part of the problem is still the old days where whistleblowing was still considered maybe being a bit of a snitch line. And there's a paradigm shift in business that's starting to happen, and I think people are embracing more of an open culture. And it's the deterrent is really, I think, getting over that hurdle, the connotation of a whistleblower. And once a company embraces that this is in fact excellent for employee morale, it's excellent for engagement, then they can start to really make the most of the line. I think I have a really great example. We had a company come on with us last year. They were having a really toxic environment and they had an issue. Once they put the whistleblower system in place, the first two calls, one identified the perpetrator, and two was someone else thanking the management team for putting it into place because they felt that management was finally saying they wanted to know what was going on in the ground.
How important is it to have financial incentives for people to take this kind of action? We have seen that in the U.S. especially, and there's some criticism about how that works.
I'm a bit hesitant to do the financial incentive program. All of our clients who currently use our system don't do it. There's a fine line of doing the right thing and then doing something to be compensated. And I think the Ontario Security Commission is kind of looking at the SEC model and trying to figure out what the right way to do it in Canada is right now.
So one of the other concerns you might have about putting this in place is that you get sort of false positives. You get people saying something's happening and it's not quite right, and it creates exactly the wrong kind of atmosphere inside your company, especially in a small company. You can imagine that being problematic. How do you guard against that?
Well, that's where we don't like the financial incentives. And one of the reasons why smaller companies, the types that we work with, are embracing this is because sometimes when you're working in a much closer environment, it's very hard to go to the director of HR or to your direct supervisor if you know someone that you work with intimately and maybe beside them in the cubicles is doing something wrong. So having an anonymous channel where it can be vetted by the top management is really key. And it actually ends up creating a more open environment for your employees. There's studies that have shown once the whistleblower hotlines put into place, employee morale goes up. And again, that's because it's creating a more nurturing environment where ethics and values are imprinted on the people.
So it doesn't create, because you'd worry that it would create this kind of culture of fear, that your neighbor is always spying on you and might think you're doing something wrong even if you're not, but it seems the opposite happens?
Yeah, somewhat. The other thing that we always try and encourage is if you're going to put a hotline in place is that you make sure you have a very strong anti-retaliation policy. So that means that it's zero tolerance for any kind of retaliation, whether it be social, whether it be for promotions, whether it be for just general your general embracing in the environment. So both, they have to go kind of in tandem. You have to have your whistleblower policy, plus you have to have the anti-retaliation, and it has to come from the tone at the top. And that's a very overused term in our world, but tone at the top is key because it needs to be imprinted from your CEO down to your middle management, down to your team. And if management doesn't seem to be taking the tone that the speak up culture is important, then it sort of goes against the credibility of the program itself.
Are there types of frauds that are the most common frauds, whether it's at small companies, private companies, or public ones? What are the ones that come up the most?
For us, in our general database, it tends to be breach of legal obligations. We're seeing a lot more procurement fraud, and we're seeing a lot of substance abuse, but I think that's based on the industries that we're working with.
And so from the point of view of companies that are interested in kind of implementing this, it's a fairly easy process in your view?
It's so simple. It's basically engaging with a third party like ourselves. We get the corporate designates, get them into the system. We have 5 ways for employees to contact us, so they can call us, they can go onto our web portal, they can email us directly, they can call, they can fax, and they can mail. So we get reports in all of those mediums, and they all go into a software platform that auto-notifies the corporate designate, and then the platform allows them to have a dialogue with the whistleblower. So not only do you get an anonymous report, but you can gain further information through the platform, and that's really key when you're doing an investigation. It's also key so that the person who's actually being brave and coming forward has that validation that the company is acknowledging the report and is actually doing something about it.
All right, Shannon, we've got to leave it there. Great to have you with us today.
Thanks so much, Amanda.
Shannon Walker is president of WhistleBlower Security.